Chapter 14, Part 1, Integration of Nervous System Functions. We're going to start with sensation. Sensations are the means by which the brain receives information about the environment and also parts of the body. So a sensation is the process initiated by stimuli acting on sensory receptors. So we receive a sensation based on what those sensory receptors are picking up. Our perception is our conscious awareness of sensations. And obviously, sensations can have some variations between people, especially pain. But some people's pain threshold is much higher than others. And that, we're not going to talk about that really, but it's interesting how those differences are, and the perception of pain can be different for different people. So we have general senses and then we have special senses, and we're going to talk about those a little further here. So general senses are distributed over a large part of the body. Our receptors generate an action potential called a generator potential that then travels to the brain. We have somatic senses, which are touch and pressure, temperature, proprioception, and pain. And then proprioception is the sense of body position and movement, just so you're aware of what that means. And then we have visceral senses, which is basically our sensations coming from our internal organs, specifically pain and pressure. In addition, we have special senses. And just to make sure you can follow what I'm doing here, the general senses include these here, okay? And then special senses are going to include smell, taste, sight, hearing, and balance. And those occur in special sense organs. The receptor will produce a receptor potential, and the receptor then releases a neurotransmitter that binds to the receptors in the membrane of the neuron, which then travels to the brain. So this is just a picture showing kind of classification of senses. I'm not going to necessarily test you on this. I just think it's interesting to look at, and it's nice to be able to, put general senses in a category and special senses separately. So as far as the different types of sensory receptors, there's a lot of different sensory receptors, and they are categorized based on the stimulus that they detect. So a mechanicoreceptor senses some sort of pressure or bending or stretching of the cells, touch, pressure, proprioception, hearing, and balance. Chemoreceptors have to do with chemicals that become attached to receptors in their membranes, like smell and taste. And thermoreceptors respond to changes in temperature. Photoreceptors respond to light. We find those in vision. And nociceptors are stimulated in extreme mechanical or chemical thermal stimuli, so in pain. And as far as what you need to know here, going through these sensory receptors, the different types, because there's quite a few that we're going to cover, flashcards are probably going to be best for this, because it's just basically knowing the description or basically defining the term. So we have different sensory receptors based on location. We have cutaneous receptors, which are associated with the skin. Visceroreceptors are associated with our organs. And remember, I know I've mentioned this earlier in the semester, that viscera are the organs of the trunk. So when you think of, the stomach or the lungs or so on, we would have visceroreceptors associated with those organs. And then proprioceptors are associated with joints and tendons, and they're good for detecting stretch. We have 8 types based on structure, so these top ones are based on location, and then the rest here are based on structure. Free nerve endings, Merkel discs, hair follicle receptors, Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner corpuscle, Ruffini end organ, muscle spindle, and Golgi tendon organ. So this is just showing where some of those sensory receptors are found in the skin, and some of this should be familiar to you from back in when we covered skin a few units ago. So free nerve endings are basically the simplest, most common sensory receptor. They're scattered throughout most of the body, especially the epithelial tissue and connective tissue. These type are responsible for temperature sensation, or there is a type that is responsible for temperature sensation, cold receptors, warm receptors, and also pain. Merkel tactile discs. So the other name for Merkel disc is tactile discs. And if you know what tactile means, it's kind of, I guess, feeling in your fingertips what you can feel. And so that's what the Merkel disc is. Basically, these are found in the epidermis. They're associated with dome-shaped mounds of thickened epidermis and hairy skin. And these are really good for detecting light touch and superficial pressure. Hair follicle receptors are basically in the hair end organs. They respond to slight bending of the hair as it occurs in light touch, or if you have like maybe a fly crawling on your skin or a mosquito on your arm or something like that, these guys will be the ones that are going to sense that. Pacinian or Pacinian corpuscles. These are deep in the dermis or the hypodermis, so they're going to be better for deep cutaneous pressure and vibration. And the Meissner corpuscle, distributed throughout the dermal papillae, used to determine the texture of objects. So when you feel a paper towel, maybe you like a certain type of paper towel, and when somebody gives you a different one, it feels real rough. Those Meissner's corpuscles are the ones that are determining that. Ruffini end organ, primarily in the dermis of the fingers, and these respond to continuous touch or pressure. Muscle spindles, 3 to 10 specialized skeletal muscle cells. They provide information about the length of the muscles. They are also involved in the stretch reflex. Golgi tendon organs, proprioceptors associated with tendons. They respond to increased tension and on the tendons. So you may have heard the term referred pain before. So referred pain is a sensation in one region of the body that is not the source of the stimulus. So you think, okay, somebody's having a heart attack and, their arm hurts. Well, you're like, well, why would my arm hurt if I'm having a heart attack? But that's what's referred to as referred pain. Organ pain is usually referred to the skin. Both the organ and that region of the skin input are coming from the same spinal segment and converge. So those neurons kind of are associated in that way, and that's why the referred pain happens like that. Chronic pain is not a response to immediate direct tissue injury. The cerebrum and the thalamus can sometimes malfunction and misinterpret discomfort as actually pain. So the brain as a whole may not properly regulate how much pain stimulation is allowed to penetrate the cerebral cortex. So things like migraines and back pain can actually be misinterpreted by the brain, and you may very well feel like you're in pain, but it's partly because the brain is just misinterpreting that information. Chronic pain can be associated with depression, frustration, helplessness, and hopelessness as well. And chronic pain will contribute, those conditions will contribute to chronic pain. All right, so sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So when we look at the different parts of the brain, different sensory information is processed in different areas. So there are areas of the brain where sensory information is picked up by the receptors, and they travel in certain pathways and project certain regions of the cerebral cortex. And that area of the brain is called the primary sensory area. So the primary sensory area is the region of the cerebral cortex to which sensory pathways project. So the primary sensory areas are divided into these different parts, primary somatosensory cortex, taste area olfactory cortex, primary auditory cortex, and visual cortex. And you can see what each of those are associated with here. The processing of that information is done in the association areas, which is located just adjacent to that primary sensory area I just on the last slide. So the sensory processing happens at the association areas. And there's a bunch of different association areas also, somatosensory association area and the visual association area. What do? They receive and integrate information from the primary sensory areas. So I'm going to go back to this first slide and say the information comes in here and then it is then processed in the association area. So basically it's the evaluation and recognition of that sensory input. And so this is just an image. You're not going to have to label the brain as far as what areas are where as far as the sensory processing stuff. But I just included this picture just so you guys had it. So spatial organization of the primary somatosensory area. I'm going to stop here and pick up on the next, on part 2, just because I don't want to keep rushing through here.